Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Nina Fernando. I am the executive director here at Shoulder to Shoulder campaign. And I want to give a shout out to Cassandra Lawrence from our team, who serves as our communications and community engagement manager and who is leading the tech here in the back end of Zoom right now. And also want to give a shout out to Uzma Saver, our development and outreach specialist, who reconnected us with Imam Latif, who we'll hear from shortly. So for those of you who don't know, Shoulder to Shoulder is a national multi-faith coalition-based campaign of 34 religious denominations, around 60 faith-based and interfaith community organizations, and thousands of individual people who are committed to addressing the problem of anti-Muslim discrimination in the United States. And we advance our vision by directly engaging faith leaders in the United States to be strategic partners in countering discrimination and violence against Muslims by connecting, equipping, and mobilizing faith communities. And since the pandemic, and particularly since Shoulder to Shoulder marked our 10-year anniversary last year, we've been hosting a series of public conversations to feature leaders who are doing good work in different capacities and utilizing different strategies and approaches to transform our society. And we're here today and grateful to be joined by Imam Latif, who is the university chaplain for New York University and the executive director of the Islamic Center at NYU. He was appointed the first Muslim chaplain at NYU in 2005, and he was also appointed the first Muslim chaplain at Princeton University in 2006. And he writes, spending a year commuting between the two institutions, he decided to commit full-time at NYU, the Islamic Center there. And his position was officially institutionalized in the spring of 2007, where he established the first ever Muslim student center at an institution higher education in the United States. Imam Latif has not only managed to solidify the basis of a strong Muslim community at NYU that seeks to emphasize inclusiveness and understanding of others without compromise, but has also worked tirelessly to foster dialogue with people of other faiths in order to clarify misconceptions and encourage mutual education. So you can read his full bio on the event page, and we're so grateful to hear from him today to talk about multi-faith solidarity, 20 years since 9/11, because as you know, on Saturday, we will mark the 20th commemoration of 9/11, 20 years since. So before we dive into that specifically, I want to open it up by noting, it occurred to me when learning about you, Imam Khalid, through your bio and witnessing your leadership in different capacities, you've been the first at a lot of things, the first Muslim chaplain at different institutions, for example. Can you tell us what it's like to pave your own way in your work and life in general? And what does that look and feel like to do something that hasn't been done before? And would just love to hear from you, what mistakes have you made? What has been exciting about it? And what have you learned from that?
Yeah, well, first off, just thank you so much for having me, inviting me to be a part of this conversation. Uh, it's probably been a while since I was the first of any kind of position. I started working as a chaplain in 2005, as you mentioned. We're now 16 years later. Uh, but as best as I can, I think the excitement of being a part of something new, the ability to kind of create and help set precedent was all there. But I think the realities of being a minority within spaces that weren't conventionally built to necessarily provide entry points for people of my background were also things that became very apparent. There was a religious scholar who I was quite close to that when he found out I was going down this route, said to me that, this is something that you would be perfect for, but just be ready. It's going to be a very lonely experience. And I couldn't really understand what that meant and how that would necessarily manifest itself. But I soon found myself quite often being not just the first Muslim chaplain, but the only Muslim in many rooms, in many meetings, in many conversations. And I think years later, I was asked by someone, how is it that you communicate so effectively and that your oratory skills are what they are, et cetera? And when I reflected on it, I said, likely a part of it had to deal with the fact that when I would walk into a room, I was more scrutinized than most people that were my counterparts, that I had to speak a certain way. I had to dress a certain way, and not just in terms of religious symbols and things to that extent, but if there was any opportunity for someone to be critical of me based off of my faith, based off of my age, based off of how the default assumption was that I was not meant to be in this place because I was the first one to hold certain roles. Uh, there wasn't room to make mistakes in ways. And that could have a lot of burdensome kind of qualities to it, but depending on the perspective that you bring. And so I think early on, what I recognized was the need to employ very solid self care strategies and to understand that my ability to provide care to other individuals, to other hearts, necessitated that I was taking care of my own heart. And I had a mindfulness of who I was in my entirety, to bear a reflection on my own wellness as best as I could. Because there was a ton of people who were super happy that I was in the roles that I was in, and they wanted to build and they wanted to do things and continue to have deep relationships with. But there was also a lot of people who felt as if it wasn't okay for me to actually be in the place that I was in. And as I'm saying this, I remember very uniquely, I worked at Princeton University as their first Muslim chaplain. And when I got on the ground there, I was 24, and I was meeting people like Cornell West, who was then at Princeton, and Toni Morrison, who was then at Princeton, people who were, from the founders of Amazon.com, and someone who was integral to the resurgence of China's economy. And I said to myself, what am I doing here? And a week later, I started to get letters from alumni of Princeton University that said things to the effect of, we don't want Muslims at Princeton. We don't want your Sharia law at Princeton. Someone like you should not ever be at a place like this. And when I went to talk to my supervisors, the heads of religious life at Princeton University, their explanation to me was simultaneous to my hiring. The head of religious life, the dean of the chapel at Princeton, a man by the name of Tom Breitenthal, he was leaving to become the Archbishop of Southern Ohio. And they said that these alumni were upset because they thought I was hired to be in his role and not the role I was in. And I said, well, that's not any better. Why couldn't I be the dean of the chapel simply because I'm Muslim? And those kind of experiences, I think, can create now that loneliness, but also create an opportunity for resilience and a paradigm shift that if you don't know why you're doing what you're doing, it can be very easy to get inundated and make compromise on places that you shouldn't have to make compromises on.
Thank you for sharing that. There's so much there that I would love to continue exploring with you, and pieces that I relate to personally, in many ways. But to honor the conversation, the topic that we want to explore, especially as we're in the lead up to just days away from the 20th commemoration of 9/11. And in many ways, this is connected to what you just shared. You talk about your experiences after 9/11 and in different capacities, how it was a pivotal moment for you in shaping how you chose to show up in the world. And I think that probably relates to you stepping into these positions, taking on the first, in many ways in these different institutions. Tell us more about how 9/11 has impacted you personally. How have the new waves of Islamophobia post 9/11 challenged or complicated your understanding of self and faith and spirituality?
So if we go back 20 years in the immediate, I would say there was a deep impact. I was an undergrad at New York University on September 11th in 2001. And I can remember the day quite vividly where I was running late to class, as was just my normal routine. And I got into class that morning, and my professor wasn't teaching. My classmates were huddled in corners of the room, kind of whispering to one another. And after a few minutes, a security guard came to the front of the door, said, "Please gather all your belongings. We have to evacuate the building. A plane has flown into the World Trade Center." We emptied out into the center of our campus, which is a park called Washington Square Park. And where it was fully empty just some short time before, there's now about 10 or 12,000 of my classmates standing in the park. There's a lot of noise and a lot of commotion. And all of a sudden, we were hit with this very heavy silence as we watched the second plane fly into the towers. And it felt like there was just a huge amount of time that had passed. In reality, it was just seconds. And as instantaneously as it hit us, it shattered into pieces, and we all went in different directions. I walked to my dorm, and when I got onto the floor that my room was on, in one of the lounges, I could hear some of my dorm mates saying, "We need to gather up all of the Muslims and send them out of the country so that things like this don't happen anymore." And nobody had even known who were the perpetrators of the attack at that time. And when they saw that I could hear them, they got silent and they said nothing. And I said, "You don't have to stop talking on my account. Feel free to continue if you believe it." They made us then evacuate that building again. And as we were going down the stairs, a young woman tried to push me down the staircase. And when I turned around and looked at her face to face, she had a lot of anger apparent on her face. We were arguably the closest Muslim community to the ground zero site at that time. And once the university reopened, we had media from all over the world that was putting microphones in our faces, wanting to know, what do Muslims think? And in that immediacy, I think there was the development now of a couple of things in retrospect. One, this huge transition into individual Muslims now losing their identity and having to represent an entire community of almost 2 billion people around the world. Everything that we said was now not me as a specific speaking to MTV or BBC or CNN, but I was just the character of a Muslim, as my peers were. And we're only 18, 19 years old. We were made to speak on panels, attend programs. And this was being done as I was attending funerals for people of my faith and other walks of life who I knew who died on that day. Federal law enforcement started to make themselves present, both in a very not so subtle manner, but attempting to be subtle, and then also very blatantly saying that we're here. And we're trying to reconcile all of this in the midst of what I think is a second thing that was developing there, this construct of, what it means to be a Muslim American. There's very few demographics that get to just call themselves American without having to hyphenate an identity or qualify their Americanness. And I don't think the rhetoric was such that it said, we are all American, but it set forth on a trajectory that creates a good bad framework. And this is what constitutes now somebody who's a good Muslim versus a bad Muslim. The same way you would have a good Black person or a bad Black person, somebody who is a good minority or a bad minority, but the standards of what's acceptable are coming from now a majority privileged demographic. When you're 18 years old and you're in the middle of all of it, you don't really have any idea what's going on. From the standpoint of multi-faith work, one of my mentors who passed away a few years ago was a Catholic priest who served as a chaplain at NYU when I was an undergrad. And I maintained a relationship with him until he passed away. And at a time when no one was making real space or providing advisement, he opened up his church to us as Muslim students and said, "You will always have a place to pray here." And it was only years later where I was walking with him on the street that we came upon one of his regular parishioners, and he said, why haven't I seen you in church for some time? And the person said, what church? And he said, what do you mean, this large church? He said, that's not a church, that's a mosque. And I found out, even as more time passed, that he had individuals who refused to donate to the church, people who would send him death threats and hate mail simply because he was providing space to us to pray. And it gave me a real standard of what it means to actually be good, to embrace pluralism, not in a tokenized manner or to have performative allyship, but in a way that you simply do what's right because it's the right thing to do. And you serve the underserved and underprivileged by leveraging your own power and privilege. As years kind of moved forward, the construct of a narrative rooted in fear was consistently imposed on myself as well as members of my community that had us now be a demographic that you were suspect of before you gave space to. In 2010, the year started pretty interestingly in that we at our Islamic Center at New York University were working on a program with the White House. And we had a public lecture with John Brennan, who was then the head of intelligence for the Obama administration. And we had a more private meeting prior to with different Muslim leaders from parts of the United States. And in the course of the public remarks, John Brennan alludes to a letter that I had written to President Obama. And he said, Imam Latif, the president received your letter and he read it, etc. He believes you to be an exemplary American citizen and things like that. A week and a half later was the first time the FBI visited me in my home. And they knocked on the door. A friend of mine was staying over and he said, the FBI is here. I alerted New York University. I live in a university building. And now I sat down with them in my living room. A public safety officer intervened, saying that you shouldn't be here, and sent them on their way. The next day, they met me at my car and they said, we want you to come with us to a federal building. I said, there's no way I'm coming with you to a federal building. They followed me to my office where we sat and talked for a much lengthier period of time. And it became clear that their questions were more so now about me as a specific person. And I said to them eventually, what is it that you want from me? And they said, you're just too good to be true. Know that we're watching you. And the impact that that has now on me on a very kind of psychological level, that I'm again just in my 20s. I have no precedent to build off of in my role. I'm the first one in it. So there's not so much mentorship. There's not so many people who can relate to this directly. So I'm hesitant in picking up my phone because I don't know who's listening on the other end. And I don't want them to engage my friends. I hesitate in going to see my family because I don't know who's following me and constantly looking over my shoulder. Towards the end of that year, on the 9th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, I'm now a Muslim chaplain also for the NYPD at this time. And by rank, I'm given the rank of an inspector. And one of the things that we would do as a police chaplain is attend the Ground Zero memorial service on September 11th itself. We would start out having breakfast at police headquarters with family members who lost loved ones on that day, and would then go to the ceremony and participate. And in 2010, on the 9th anniversary of the attacks, it was the first time I had an interaction with our current president, Joe Biden, who was then the vice president, as he was attending the memorial service. It was a little bit more closed off because construction was still being done on the current memorial structure that's there. And so they had a stage where the ceremony took place. In front of the stage, an area for VIPs, city officials, electeds, etc. Behind them, a place for the press to view. And then behind that was a place for the public. And so I'm waiting with family members and others in the VIP area in my inspector's uniform, a police uniform, for the ceremony to get started. And while we're waiting for things to get underway, 3 men approached me wearing suits, saying that Secret Service has spotted you from the top of a building. They want us to check your credentials just in case. And I said, just in case what? And they said, we're sorry that we're doing this to you. And I said, then why are you doing it? And to understand what they're questioning in that moment is not merely my physical presence at that location, but the entire validity of my emotion attached to that space. I was a student in New York on September 11th in 2001. I did watch the second plane fly into the towers and have to deal with media removing my identity, standing with friends of mine in long lines who were immigrants that now had to check in at immigration services for 4 or 5 hours at a time in the snow, dealing with friends whose families' homes were raided by law enforcement, people facing deportation, funerals of loved ones who died on the day, and so much more that is informed by the atrocities of that day. And in that moment, these men are questioning the validity of all of it. And the frustrating thing isn't that I'm going through it, but what can I really do about it? That if I was to respond, it would likely make the circumstance a lot worse for me. And so where I couldn't speak, and there was tons of people just standing and watching, doing nothing, there was a mother standing next to me who lost her son on September 11th. And she said to those men that what you are doing right now is more dishonoring of the memory of our loved ones that we lost on that day than anything else. They hear this young man is standing with us in our moment of need, and you're making it seem as if he's doing something wrong just because he's Muslim. And as easily as they had taken the validity away, she brought it right back. What I would say on an impact level is that, one, somebody sitting somewhere concocted a policy that trickled down to these men that said, if you see someone that looks like this, look at them again, right? I'm literally in a police uniform. And even if I wasn't, it still wouldn't be okay. And this is the reality that minority communities face in this country day to day. To me, a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment on an individual and kind of institutional level is just symptomatic of a deeply entrenched anti-Blackness that the country is built upon. That race and class are the elements that our country has struggled with. I don't believe anyone has a problem with me because of my religious theology, because I have a God the way that others have a God, and holidays and prayer. Like conceptually, you can understand it. But what people struggle with are the same things we've been struggling with since the inception of this country. Someone was to ask me if I was to go through it again, I'd say definitely. So if certain battles have to be won, they have to take place in the first place in order for them to be won. And so if my standing is going to yield understanding, then I'm going to continue to stand. And that's what we need people to do. That you might be the only one speaking, or you might be the only one that's standing, but you might be what's necessary to ignite others to get out of their seats or share their voice. And I think the deepest impact to me from that instance, sorry, I know I talk a lot, was this mother who to me represents just what we need more of these days. That she recognized the uniqueness of her power and privilege and leveraged it to serve someone who is underserved and underprivileged. Because who in their right mind is going to say something to a mother who is standing at the ground zero site on September 11th that has lost a child? Nobody. And she knows that. And she uses it just because it's the right thing to do. And that to me is somebody who understands both allyship, solidarity, as well as what pluralism really is about. Because it's easy to tokenize and be ceremonial and to say, well, here's where I can't stand with you. But she did it in the moment, and others could have as well, but there was something else that was in her. And to me, that's what I want to be. You know, that's what I want to aspire towards being within the roles that I'm blessed to serve people through. To take on a mode and model that recognizes how we construct and build, but at the same time, you just do what's right, because simply some things are just right and wrong. and you want to do what's right because it's the right thing to do.
Totally. I had all these questions to ask you about what multi-faith solidarity looks like, and you have shared that in your remarks. Do what's right because it's right. Do what's right, even if it's hard. Having the courage, taking the risk. Even though you will experience pushback, even though it can be lonely. And I really appreciate these insights, into what allyship looks like, into what solidarity looks like, into what, like, using your influence in the space to make change, to intervene rather than stand by and watch. Uh, tell us a little bit more about what multi-faith solidarity, or really what your vision for America, for our communities, for coming together across difference, for living up to our ideals, ideals that have not yet been realized. And what does that look like? Knowing what you've been through, knowing what we've been through, what does it look like in the years ahead? What are we working towards, and how do we get there?
I think principally one of the ways that we can understand what something could ideally look like is by first identifying what it should not look like ever. And I think to recognize that a 20-year anniversary of a tragedy should be something that people stand in honor of, but to understand that the lessons that we need to derive from a moment like this can't be only rooted in a 20-year trajectory. We have to look much further if we want to get to where we want it to be. To me, when I say race and class become the foundation of this, that's what I honestly believe. When people left to make this place their home from a European context, there wasn't an aspiration within a European sphere to be a space of diversity. And as individuals were launching transatlantic slave trades and crusades in the names of faith and tradition, and then approached more of a sense of liberalism in order to counter some of what was taking place socially there. In the United States, we didn't fight our worst battles or wars in the names of any spiritual tradition or faith, but our worst battle, our civil war, was done on principles of race and class. And you can see, even within the foundational documents of this, that privilege and power was given entirely, primarily to individuals who identified as white and male. Women weren't really given anything, and Black people weren't even considered to be a whole person in comparison to their white counterparts. And the challenges that we find ourselves in a place now, have to see societally, well, what's really at play to counter it, to build what we know it should not be. It shouldn't be the case that some people are able to have access to adequate healthcare and others are not. It shouldn't be the case that there's no consequences to the perpetrators of violence against our Black brothers and sisters who consistently get shot in the streets by law enforcement. It shouldn't be the case that, I don't worry that someone's going to take my 6-year-old or 8-year-old away from me, but I walk out every day assuming that somebody might take me away from my family. And there's people who these are not their realities. The constructs that we deal with have patterns that can be understood, right? The war on terror that rears itself post 9/11 and yields a Patriot Act, yields Guantanamo Bay, yields the realities of destabilizations of entire regions of the world. We put the people of Afghanistan through just real hell. And all of this is stemming from a war on terror that we understand its roots to replicate, for example, the way a war on drugs gets concocted, right? Politicians utilizing terminology like predator and thug to identify our Black brothers and sisters, as TV shows like Cops air to reinforce those stereotypes, usually with white men in blue uniforms arresting Black people. And crack cocaine gets pumped through neighborhoods with nobody asking where the drugs come from in the first place. But the prison industrial complex builds itself on the back of mass incarceration. that's just a further step in a stratified society that starts from slavery, goes to Jim Crow, and channels now Black people into the prison system. And the war on terror builds itself out similarly, with politicians utilizing terminologies like terrorist, jihadist, fundamentalist, TV shows like Homeland and 24 airing all over television, and people now rendering themselves passive in a state where they have capacity to break down and speak out, but they're seated because the fear-based construct that's presented to them stokes the negative stereotypes that elicits now passivity in the face of this. You know, when Trump was elected in 2016, the world saw like so many things that weren't hidden before, but could no longer be denied existence of, in terms of issues around race and bigotry and hatred. And there was upticks in all kinds of hate crimes. One of the things that I distinctly remember is going to a park in Brooklyn called Adam Yauch Park, named after one of the Beastie Boys, where there was a press conference because a children's playground shortly after Trump's election was found vandalized with swastikas, things like make America white again, go Trump, etc. And there was a lot of people at this thing, politicians and celebrities, other Beastie Boys were there, and I think Ben Stiller was there, and Big Daddy Kane, and senators and Congress people and faith leaders. And when I got on the mic, I said to people, this swastika represents to me the darkest potentials of humanity. That you had individuals who were so motivated by their hatred that their entire ambition and purpose was the annihilation and extinction of our Jewish brothers and sisters from this world. But it also exemplifies a second dark potential of humanity, that there were those who definitively were moved to perpetrate these atrocious acts through their hatred, but their success was only allowable because so many more who had the ability to stop them simply sat back and watched and did nothing. And that, to me, is what becomes the biggest challenge in this kind of harmonious sense of existence. You have a system and set of systems that are built to privilege certain demographics. And the willingness to share that privilege creates now an opportunity to become passive or part of the process of erasure of what other people go through. In order for it to be broken down, real multi-faith work has to have its individual members and parts recognize how they themselves benefit from the iniquitous systems that hold other people down. And until individuals, that I believe we as faith leaders have a responsibility to convey to whatever communities we're a part of, recognize that they too might gain from these systems, and despite the gain that they have from it, they should still dismantle it. We're going to still see what it is that is taking place continue. Good religion to me is not self-serving. That to me is just antithetical to good religion. Good religion to me should bring its practitioner to take on social ailments and injustices. And if your practice of religion is not bringing you to that, I would say with real love, what is the point of your religion? And there is no greater ailment in society right now than the ailment of racism. And if we are not coming together as people of faith to remedy these social illnesses and ailments, theologically, we might have distinctions, but none of our religions own values that we claim to be a part of our traditions. But if we're not living those values without conditions and qualifications, then we're just as much of a part of the problem. What does somebody have to look like for you to not be there for them? What part of the world, what side of a conflict, etc. And I honestly don't understand it sometimes. You know, I work with a lot of survivors of abuse. I founded with some members of our community through our Islamic Center at NYU, a DV agency over the course of the pandemic. And we work with different people, and it boggles my mind how there are individuals that are known to be perpetrators of abuse. They mistreat others, and yet there are still those who will find room to create like a both sides type narrative, right? I have to maintain a relationship with this person. That's my friend. And even though you're my friend and you were the abused person in this relationship, you have to understand, how can I leave him alone? It's like, no, you should leave him alone, right? He mistreated this person in a way that has implications that are deeply problematic. For whatever reason, in the prism of modernity, it seems to be the sense that there's a higher kind of consciousness if you're able to maintain objectiveness. Objectiveness is just another way to maintain neutrality. And where you are in a space of inequity, you cannot both sides circumstances. There's no way to say that certain things have validity on both ends of an occasion, because there are those who definitely do not want to be connected to others. There are definitely people who have no desire to share space with someone who has a different skin color than them, or a different country of origin, or a different cultural heritage, or a different level of wealth. And if we are to acknowledge this as people of faith, the entire paradigm of our gatherings are meant to be based off of principles of inclusivity, not exclusivity, right? I work at a university. I used to work at Princeton. Princeton is Princeton not because of who it lets in, students with GPAs, extracurriculars, etc. But Princeton is also Princeton because of who it keeps out. And if Princeton started to let everybody in through its gates, it wouldn't be Princeton anymore. And that's how we identify our own sense of worth at times, not just about who we let in, but who we keep out. What would people say if they saw me speaking out against what I know to be inequitous? What would somebody say if I started to let certain people like this into the spaces that I'm in? But when you think about gatherings that are of the divine, they are theoretically meant to be gatherings that anybody and everyone should have access to, regardless of where they're at. And I think that has to become now a recognition of what we aspire towards within our own spaces, but still convening on shared internals, shared values, shared hearts, and not shared externals, race, class, ethnicity, so that we start to really dismantle things. And we start to say things that might not be the most popular, but again, they're what's right. And that has to be what the motivation is.
Preach. Thank you so much. This is such incredible insight, super profound in thinking, helping us think through what this could look like. I want to ask a question about violence committed in the name of religion. How do you navigate the questions that people ask? How do you think about even the violence that has emerged since and throughout these years, white Christian supremacists? How do you talk about and think about violence committed by individuals claiming to ascribe to a religion, and especially also in light of the conversations around 9/11?
I think a key part to understanding how we deal with tragic responses to things comes from first recognizing who's actually telling the story, right? There's a great author and scholar that many of you probably know by the name of Chimamanda Adichie. It's an amazing individual. And she has written numerous books and articles. If you're not somebody who's able to find the time to do that, you can check out a TED Talk that she wrote. It's called The Danger of a Single Story, right? Where she essentially posits her talk on her own socialization being filled with childhood books and stories. The characters did not look like her. And as she builds now a sense of self rooted as a Black woman around her engagement of characters that tended to mostly be white with blonde hair and blue eyes. But she goes on and continues to say that, you know, the stories are told by usually the ones who are in places of power and privilege. And they're not just determining what the story is, but also where it starts. One of her more powerful lines is, you know, she says, they choose to start the story of Native Americans with them simply having arrows in their hands and shooting them, as opposed to saying, well, what came before that? And why is that an important thing to understand? Because you can very much so recognize how narrative then casts perspective on demographics who are dealing with life and struggle in whatever ways that they possibly are dealing with it, and some things that we might not ever really have to go through in our lives. And it's hard to then see what someone's life experience is when I'm only channeling it through my own lived experiences, or the media narratives that are telling me to think a certain way without it creating an entire holistic perspective. There are individuals who engage within acts of white supremacist violence that I would say are motivated by what they really believe whiteness and supremacy to call towards. And to recognize this as a mindset and an ideology, right? Supremacy is something that exists globally now, and you can find it. I've been to Myanmar. I've sat with Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, where not one of them could tell me that they hadn't seen loved ones burned alive in front of their eyes. These are people who are internally displaced, and I've met those who have fled violence in their country in Malaysia, in Mecca, in Saudi Arabia, in Chicago, and nobody knows what's going on with them. You have supremacy in India that's taking place now, where there's mob violence that's just running rampant, right? And so many other spaces. What supremacy is claiming is that the primordial state of existence is an individual who is white. And on a spectrum that you now can aspire towards whiteness, but at the very least, the mindset is such that you don't want to be Black. And it roots itself in that prism of anti-Blackness. That state of supremacy claims that some of us are always from someplace else. No matter where it is that we were born, what passport we have, we are always from elsewhere, right? I took 20 of my students to have lunch one day at a street cart near our center pre-COVID. And while we were waiting for our food, chicken and rice cart, you know, there's a middle-aged Caucasian woman at the back of the line pushing her way through the group saying, excuse me, excuse me, excuse me, can't you understand what I'm saying? And when she gets to the front of the line, she looks at me face to face and she says, oh, I guess you can't understand. How do they say, excuse me, where you come from? And I said, we say, excuse me. And she said, no, how do they say it where your family is from? And I said, my family is from Jersey, and we say, excuse me. And she couldn't understand how somebody that looks like this is actually from the same place that she's from. And this is a challenge, right? Because that mindset is not just somebody was mean to me in a line of food, but people now sit at institutional hierarchies where they are determining how people will live day to day, how they will work day to day. And it tends to be mostly a demographic that is elderly white men that is sitting now only with the stereotypes of those that are not what they are and making decisions as to how they will live. Supremacy also tells us that there's always a reason why we do what we do, But there's some people who there's no need for explanation as to why what they do. It's going to always be the norm. And we have to aspire towards that. And it creates a psychological lockdown. If you buy into that mindset and you're motivated by it, you then don't believe that the people you're killing are human like you are. You have a notion that I am entitled to treat them in this way because they are less than me. I am what is the primordial state of existence. They are subpar. They don't have the right or deserve to have access to security or comfort or any of these kinds of things. And it becomes emboldened by, again, rhetoric, the synergy of media and politics that could care less on the receiving end of it what's happening to people. For Muslims, there's a racialization of the faith. I've had people who have come to me who are Latinos that have crosses hanging from their necks, that have literally left roses on my office desk because they've said walking around the village of Manhattan, which is like super liberal place, people have spit on them, cursed at them, told them that they are Arab Muslim terrorists and should go back to their country. And their responses were to give me flowers, to give women that they know that wear headscarves flowers, others flowers, because they've said, we are only beginning to understand what it's like for you to be who you are in the spaces that we're in. You have, I think, a very sick society that is willing to engage in acts of violence more and more. And if we don't pay attention to what it's showing us, right? The same way your body tells you when it's not well, your stomach tells you it's hungry, your throat tells you it's thirsty. With every act of violence committed, we are killing our humanity more and more and more, desensitizing ourselves to things in pursuit of what exactly? And the influence of wealth here has to be understood, because we have turned war into a business and a glorification of war. We literally went into Afghanistan and have broke it down and built it up and broke it down and built it up just to break it down and build it up again, so that people are making money off of every single aspect of this. In a lot of religious traditions, you have an idea of vice versus virtue, sins versus whatever, right? And not to engage on it in a judgmental level, my tradition does not necessarily have the concept of like 7 deadly sins the way that other religious traditions do, but there's concepts of these types of things, you know, gluttony, lust, etc. And what you see societally is that corporations have now learned how to take these things and utilize them as a means to get people to believe that their sense of happiness is rooted in buying what it is that they're selling to them. And to push forward now more and more and more in this way to then dilute an understanding of what's really happening on a global level. What has to happen to people miles away for you to drive that car that you drive, or to wear that shirt that you wear? What's happening to the earth that you walk on that allows for you to eat the food that you eat or do most of what you do, right? We are not like the strongest of animals. We're not the fastest. We can't fly on our own volition or swim to the depths of the seas. We're the only animals that even after our stomachs are filled, we keep eating. And we don't care who else has no food as long as our plates are filled. And that egocentricity is a product of that supremacy. And you keep seeing these symptoms and pockets of things pop up. People are engaged in mass shootings. People are attacking others. Next week, I'm going to be going to Arizona to attend a memorial service for a man by the name of Balbir Singh Sodhi, who was the first person killed after 9/11. A person who engaged in an act of supremacist violence was just looking, he said himself, for Muslims to kill. And he found this man who is Sikh, that had a beard and a turban and brown skin, and just assumed he was Muslim, and he killed him. And so on the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, Balbir Singh Sodhi's family has been getting together annually to remember him. And they too have a 20th anniversary of their loved one being killed in an act of hate, an act of bigotry. And that can't ever be a solution. The result is one that can really just pass it from heart to heart. And what it necessitates is a disruption that we don't meet hate with more hate, but we meet that hate with love, right? We want to be people who begin to hate hate and really love love. And to not see that as something that is just cliche or platitudinal, but you gotta want to have the same things that you have for yourself for others. Even if that means that when you speak out against oppression, you're speaking out against yourself and not making justifications for it. And that's going to be the hardest thing. But I think there's like real sickness that's out there. And money is influencing how we do pretty much everything, from gun control to who gets medications and who does not. I mean, it's crazy. In the midst of a pandemic, we're the only country that saw thousands of people lose healthcare while a global pandemic is taking place. How is that possible? But somebody sitting somewhere on a human level believes that it's okay to make guns so accessible, or that it's okay to take healthcare away from people, or that it's okay to like make so many of the decisions that they're making. They're likely not thinking about us as a shared human family. And that's why those of us who claim to think that way have to understand the need to adapt multi-faith work for what the common contemporary issues are. And some of it is going to have to now be versatile enough to say that we got to get out of the dialogue sessions and discussion groups that can easily turn into photo ops and go out there and do some things that are enacting real change for people.
Yes, I totally agree. And I feel like what you're saying as you focused in on white Christian supremacy can be applied, to other traditions when people claim a tradition or claim a faith and claim a tradition, and commit harm, in that on that behalf. It is this problem of believing they are a representative of a primordial state, and that all others are not, and dehumanization. And so I think that applies to across the board. I'm not surprised at all that we are coming up on the hour, and this conversation has gone by so fast. To close out, want to think about the concept of and the power of multi-generational learning. Multi-faith solidarity is coming together across faith and cultural lines, but also across generations, and what we can learn from one another. In many ways, you talked about how you as a young person were shaped and have moved in these spaces, in the years leading up to now, to today. What are some lessons or thoughts that you want to leave us with for young people, for our children, for those that are in college, those that are young adults, in their 20s and 30s, to our elders, and everywhere in between? What are some nuggets of insight that you want to share, and leave us with as we close out this hour?
Yeah, one, I would say, don't treat hope as something that's fleeting, but treat it as a reality. Things are going to be better, and there's always progression and movement, but you have to believe that something is possible in order for you to work towards making it happen as best as you can. And I think within that, too, as a young person, look to the people around you and sit down and be bold enough to ask questions like, what are we going to do to make a difference? It doesn't have to be on a grand scale, but if you can even impact one heart, that will make all of the difference. I had a student at New York University who, when the polar vortex was happening in New York City, all she did was walk around various dorms, ask if anyone had extra pairs of clean socks, and then she went and distributed those to people who were homeless on the street. And did she solve homelessness? No. She, though, helped people to remember that they're not forgotten. And that's a key element. You start to look to the people around you in your places of work, in your classrooms and elsewhere, and you create interdisciplinary modes of institutional development, because there's a value for every skill set and talent. To be a multi-faith leader does not mean you're the one standing in the pulpit. It means that you take a salient part of your identity and you allow for that to inform the good work that you do. And so you can do that from any faith tradition and be in any role whatsoever. The third that I would say is that you want to understand the need for strategy and patience. Organized evil will always triumph over disorganized righteousness. And that's just truth. And so you want to sit and you want to build in a way where you're putting pen to paper and you are crafting plans that say, how do we get from point A to point B with the steps outlined in between? You know, what will success look like for me, and work my way backwards so that there's actually a plan that's there, right? Many organizations can be event-based, which is not a problem. You want to be process-driven so that the good work continues, but you're bringing the best of your talents to it. And the fourth thing that I would say is just make sure that you're taking care of yourself. You have a physical, mental, emotional, spiritual sphere to you, and you're not going to be able to do right by others if you're not doing right by yourself. I learned this the hard way, and it could be a really, different conversation in and of itself, but it can get very tiresome. And if you don't have good outlets and solid plans for your own self-care, it'll catch up to you at some point. You are entitled to have relationships that are deep with others. You're entitled to take time for your own development and growth. And not because you're responsible for the whole world or your growth is tied to them, but you doing for others doesn't mean that you can't do for yourself. And so you built into your routine that opportunity for self-reflection, self-growth, self-care. And you're going to see that you're going to get things done that nobody believes is possible that could ever happen. And the last thing that I would say is, if I can be helpful to any of you in anything you have going on, feel free to reach out. I'd be more than happy to help in whatever way. And my sincerest prayers are that you all are safe and that you and your loved ones are protected from any type of affliction or ailment. And any of you who have lost anything over the last year or two, or even before, my sincerest condolences to you all on that. But if you're in New York City and I can ever be helpful to you, or even if virtually there's something I could do for you, please don't hesitate in reaching out. We can only build together what we can when we're actually together. And it would be my honor to help in any of the good work that you're doing. It makes sense for me to be a part of that.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this amazing conversation and these insights that are super deep and profound. I hope you're seeing all the love that's being shared in the chat, and I hope that Shoulder to Shoulder can be a part of this sense of organized righteousness, some small part, of making change. And moving us towards multi-faith solidarity, and that there is a space for those of us that ascribe to a faith tradition, as well as those of us who believe that this world could be better, and having faith and hope in that possibility. And there is so much work to do. I want to acknowledge that there were more questions that came in, and we just want you to know that we're here at Shoulder to Shoulder, and you heard Imam Khalid also make himself available to unpack further, and so just please reach out if you want to talk more and have some better understandings. A lot of what we do at Shoulder to Shoulder is help people understand how to talk about these issues responsibly, how to address anti-Muslim discrimination in different ways from our different locations, and do that with strategy, and do that with messaging. And so please reach out if you want to go deeper. I also want to close by quickly saying that we have next month in October a workshop on allyship as an active way of life. And you'll be introduced to a framework for understanding allyship as an active way of life that utilizes bridge building to ensure equality, opportunity, and inclusion for everyone. And this framework will be presented, has been created, and will be presented by Whitney Parnell. You'll receive some follow-up information about that to talk more about that. And then also, we have our next virtual Faith Over Fear training coming up in October. And so, want to encourage those of you who want to go deeper, and even for those of you who have already been through it, to join us again or invite others to join us. This is a chance to think through about our own unique roles in this work, depending on where we stand, understand and contextualize Islamophobia in the United States, how to talk about these issues without reinforcing negative stereotypes, how to move people on this issue, and then finally strategies, what we can do, ideas and approaches to this work. So hope that you will join us. And once again, thank you so much, Imam Khalid, for this amazing conversation. I think we all learned something new, have more nuance to understanding where we're going, and really grateful for you taking the time and sharing.
Thank you for having me. Thank you all for joining.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thanks.